It's my absolutely distinct pleasure to introduce Herbert Girardet. I don't know what your honorific preference is, Mr. Dr. Filmmaker, world consultant. So his accomplishments would take a long time to go through. They're really quite extraordinary. What caught my eye, really, I have to admit, is that between 1996 to 2008, Herbert was chairman of the E.F. Schumacher Society. And for those of you who did not grow up as we did with an understanding that resources are finite, E.F. Schumacher was really a seminal figure in trying to rethink economics and growth for sustainability. And so it's really quite a pleasure for me personally to meet Herbert because of that. He's also been a filmmaker. He was telling us earlier, a movie, documentary film on the urban metabolism of London, which I'm very eager to see, actually, and has been traveling to various places around the world talking about and consulting in the area of urban sustainability and resource use, with a particular focus on water, if I understand correctly.
Water, also energy, a lot
water
of
and energy.
Yeah.
And so he's going to talk to us and be a little provocative today, challenging the notion of sustainability, but I think coming from the idea that something needs to be done. So we're going to find out what that is today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And I'm really delighted to be here because all of this started when I emailed Stephanie about 6 weeks ago saying I'm coming to visit my daughter-in-law and my son and their lovely little boy who live here in LA, and there they are, not the little boy. But and my wife and I came to visit them, and I thought it would be nice to touch base with people in LA working on these issues. And I got a very kind almost immediate response from Stephanie saying it would be nice to meet up firstly, and then would I like to come and do a talk. So here I am talking about not sustainable but about regenerative cities, and I'll be going into what I think the difference might be in whether the concept of sustainability is still as relevant when it was first initiated 25 years ago by the Brundtland Commission. Anyway, here we go. So the talk is on creating regenerative cities, which is also the title of a book I'm currently working on for Routledge, and I have produced, by the way, a report called Regenerative Cities for one organization that I'm currently working with called the World Future Council, which is based mainly in different parts of Europe, which is concerned with trying to become a voice of future generations. I mean, we are always living in the here and now, and we are forgetting very much that there might be some people coming after us. And also maybe, in many, many years and decades and even thousands of years from now. And what are we doing to them and their chances if we carry on their current trajectory of global economic growth and resource use and so on. So a city, Patrick Geddes, I'm sure you know this wonderful thinker on cities, a British thinker on cities, who died about 50 years ago. City's more than a place, it's a drama in time and space, and what I will be arguing is that the space is not just within cities themselves, but the long distance impacts that we have through our urban lives today on the global environment. So here's a quick summary of what I'll be talking about. So it's sustainable or regenerative development. I'll be raising a question. I've got three concepts of the city that I'll be talking about. The agropolis, which is a city of the past growing out of its own hinterland. Petropolis, the city of today, and then further down the concept of ecopolis. And so then talking about ecological footprints and looking at the concept of urban ecology and whether or not it really is sufficient to just look within cities or whether we need to look beyond the urban periphery when we define what urban ecology means. So cities are major villains in terms of their resource consumption, but ultimately in the context of climate change, they will also be victims of their own success, potentially. And then looking at water dependence, cities as change agents, and then a particular case study of Adelaide, where I worked 10 years ago. And then so looking finally at the concept of ecopolis. So I'm trying to differentiate between sustainable development, which here from the Brundtland definition, aims to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, this, of course, has become a sort of mantra of the world community ever since the summit, the Rio summit in '92. And I'm afraid, I think my conclusion in recent months has been really there's been too much lip service paid to that concept. It's been usurped by all sorts of interests for their own purposes. You know, companies talk about sustainable profits, never mind the consequence of that. People talk about sustainable growth, is that possible? Or indeed, you know, sustainability as a concept at a time when we have done very little sustaining over the last 25 years. You know, should we simply try and sustain depleted ecosystems that have already been wrecked by us, or do we need to actually get into a regeneration mode? So that's why I'm beginning to kind of develop the concept of regenerative development, which aims for an environmentally enhancing, but above all else, a restorative relationship between humanity and the world's ecosystems. And in an urban context, of course, you know, we have huge variety of ecosystems that we ultimately depend on to make our urban lives possible. So starting then here with the concept of agropolis, which comes, this diagram comes from the work of a 19th century German geographer called Heinrich von Thünen, who basically argued that if you, in the absence of major transport systems, you have a logical way in which you arrange supply of food, of timber around your city. So the closest to the city would be the market gardens, as we call them in Europe, the vegetable supply, which rely on intensive refertilization of soils through compost, through manure, including animal manure, but also human manure. And interesting, you know, some 25 years ago, I filmed in a German town called Dinkelsbühl. With the BBC, we were doing a TV series on the history of human impact at the time called Far from Paradise. And we filmed in this little town, which was one of the last walled towns in Germany. And the cows were still being herded into the town itself at night and stabled inside the town and then taken out again to graze in the morning and come back in the evening, you know, to be milked and so on. So the manure was actually concentrated, you know, the animal manure together with the human manure within the town and then taken out to the market gardens to keep the land productive. So then further out from the market gardens, you have the town forest, because timber is heavy, firewood is required in the absence of fossil fuels and has to be brought in, and so the reliance on distant supplies of firewood would be very tedious indeed. And then you have gradually the less and less intensive cultivation systems for grain, the cropping systems for potatoes, grains, cabbage, whatever else it may be, and finally the rough grazing at the end of the circle. So this kind of was identified by Heinrich von Thünen as something that could be found all over Europe ultimately, again emphasizing in the absence of major transport systems. And also other studies have been done in China and India and so on, finding similar concepts could be found. And so certainly this is the kind of type of city that we've left behind as a result of, yeah, here a couple of visual examples of how that could still be illustrated today, or from maps, 17th century maps, that's the town surrounded by its city wall, and then the landscape, the productive landscape on the further afield. And then comes the Industrial Revolution, and suddenly we have new sources of energy. Of course, one has to emphasize in agropolis, the only energy source is muscle power, human and animal, and water power and some wind power, but that's it, basically. Whereas here with London in the late 18th, early 19th century, suddenly we have urban growth setting in on the basis of availability of fossil fuels, the Industrial Revolution, all of that, new technologies for pumping water out of deep coal mines and so on. And so suddenly we have an energy source that surpasses anything that has ever been there in the history of humanity. And so you have these kind of pictures of cities lit up. London grew from about 1 million in 1800 to 8.5 million in just before the Second World War, and was the great pioneering, what you might call unsustainable city, pioneer in unsustainability, you could say. Copied then, of course, in one way or another as an urban system in different parts of the world, and certainly New York, of course, was not far behind, and so was Los Angeles and other cities in the United States. So reliance on these types of energy sources, initially on coal, of course, but gradually the long-distance supplies of gas and oil and so on we take for granted to make our urban lifestyles possible. So Los Angeles, of course, following closely behind London and New York as an extraordinary urban system, fascinating, culturally exciting, amazing monuments with wonderful surrounding landscapes. But then, certainly this extraordinary reliance on the freeway as the main source of transport, and that, of course, in its dependence on fossil fuels. But of course, what has happened in Europe and America is now being copied worldwide. Shanghai is an extraordinary example, and just a couple of images of urban growth here. Watch this space here and compare it with what has happened in the next picture. Right? That's 30 years of urban growth. This is the new Manhattan of China, of course. And I actually went to visit Shanghai in the mid-90s, and looking down from one of these towers here, this hotel was one of the early skyscrapers, you could still see this sort of rippled, what you might call corrugated fields of what used to be farmers' market gardens on this landscape of what has now become Pudong here. Extraordinary what's going on here. But, Dubai is another example. This picture was taken in the 80s, and this is what it looks like now, the same street. And now this, further development, the tallest tower in the world, of course, that is now that's 750 meters. That, of course, is not big enough for people elsewhere. So in Jeddah, they're now building a tower over 1 kilometer tall, Some people say this is erective malfunctioning, I don't know. But anyway, certainly it's an issue of concern that one always has to undo or go beyond what another city has already done in terms of urban structures. And here's just a picture of the urban growth of Dubai as expected over the coming years. Now this, like Los Angeles, is in a city without any local water resources to speak of. And the same is true, and I've done a lot of work recently in Saudi Arabia and in Dubai and other places, Qatar, Doha, and so on. And everywhere you look, there are cities that basically shouldn't be there. Now, I'm not saying Los Angeles shouldn't be here, but certainly those cities shouldn't be there because, historically speaking, the lack of water meant you cannot build big cities. So what are they doing? There's 120 desalination plants now on the Gulf Coast, 120, all relying entirely on massive inputs of oil and gas. Something like 20–25% of the energy supply to the Gulf cities. And there are a dozen of them now, all in a million, 2 or 3, 4 million mark. And so their reliance on desalinated water is total. And when it comes to food supply, of course, there's no food supply locally either. I recently saw a fascinating study of Saudi Arabia, which until 2008 was producing a large bulk of its wheat supply from groundwater sources. And suddenly, in 2008, the quantity of import of grain to Saudi Arabia went up 1,800% in 1 year. Why? Because they had realized that the groundwater was going saline, that the irrigation system that supplied the Saudi cities was basically no longer feasible. So now these cities have to get food from elsewhere. What do? They buy up land in Ethiopia, in Sudan, and so on and so forth. So the existential basis of urban systems really needs to be clearly understood, and how long-lived these cities are likely to be if this reliance on inputs is so utterly total. So what I'm arguing is that we don't live in agropolis any longer, we live in petropolis. So this city utterly dependent on these external input, with fossil fuels, of course, being the primary one. And so certainly then the question is, how viable is this urban form, this urban type of systems design? And it's very interesting. I don't know whether you know the work of Newman and Kenworthy at Perth University, who've shown the different densities in cities around the world and their increasing reliance on transportation fuels in terms of per capita use of fuels. So here on the right-hand side, you have the mainly Asian high-density cities where people can still move on foot or certainly can largely rely on public transport systems. You have the European cities, which are not as dense as these, particularly these recent Asian cities, but nevertheless have still got a higher level of density than we find, say, in Australia or in Canada. And then the very high dependence on per capita injections of transportation fuels as a direct result of very low density.
Do you know what year that was done?
Yeah, it's quite a while ago, actually.
Yeah, that's inaccurate now, actually.
Yeah. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so more recent studies have shown that Los Angeles is the densest metropolitan area in the United States.
Right, okay.
So it would be to the right, I suppose, of New York.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Okay, and so certainly there's the development of public transport systems, and that is now happening. And that is directly linked to densification of suburbs as well, isn't it? Which is a very interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, so there's change that's occurring.
Yeah.
I just was curious.
No, it's good. I'm glad you pointed that out.
LA now, the county has the second highest ridership in the nation before Chicago.
Right.
40.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, feel free to comment. You know, stop me at any time during this talk. Please do so. But yes, please.
You're talking about Dubai and all the desalination. How efficient are they at purifying the water for reuse once it's been desalinated, or do they just keep?
Well, once the water has been desalinated and it is then soiled with soap or with human feces or whatever, you know, certainly. It is a major technical process to do so, but once it's desalinated, in theory, it can be reused. No, I'm coming back to that in a minute. Yeah. But certainly, it's a major issue for all.
Back to that same slide, you were talking about it mostly dependent upon petroleum. There was one before that about the desalination, but it takes an abundant amount of fresh water also in a desalination plant. Where are they getting that?
I don't know. I think, I mean, it's all the water that is used in the plant is actually from seawater. So they would, I don't think, to my knowledge, I mean, any fresh water that they would have to be produced firstly from seawater, I would have thought. Yeah.
Yeah, it's on the coast.
Yeah. So here, you know, the issue of densities of cities, again, from the work of Newman and Kenworthy. And, you know, you challenged that point that, you know, the low density of Australian or US cities, you know, in terms of reliance on private transport is becoming a little bit redundant in terms of the fact that the combination of densification of suburbs and building of new transit lines is beginning to improve matters. But certainly, I mean, one issue that's very interesting, which this slide shows very strikingly perhaps, is that certainly urban form and in terms of human numbers can vary vastly. I mean, we have now 20 or so mega cities of 10 million or more people around the planet, all coming out of this fossil fuel revolution, really. And the densities vary enormously in terms of spatial use of space, in terms of the per capita use of availability of space. So we have this urbanizing world that we live in, and so certainly the question of how long that can continue in this form with this utter reliance on fossil fuels is one of the great unanswered questions of our time, and I think there could be a good discussion around that topic later on. But certainly here's just some quick look at energy consumption per capita, and that certainly is an important issue in terms of what one achieves with this energy consumption in terms of quality of life. And so certainly, I mean, the figures also not quite, if you include the Middle East, the figures per capita are even much higher than those of the US or Canada. But certainly in Switzerland, for instance, they're talking about what they call a 2,000 watt society. So in other words, currently Switzerland uses about 5,000 watt per person, and they reckon they can bring that down to 2,000 watt per person without too much change in lifestyles by simply greater energy efficiency of buildings, transport systems, water systems, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, there's been a lot of talk and discussions about urban growth, but I think it's even more important how to look at urban growth in the context of the global impacts of urban living at this moment in time. So human numbers went up fourfold in the 20th century, and will go up much further. Well, we are now at 7 billion. And human urban numbers have grown up 15-fold, so this process of urbanization that took place historically far exceeded that of human numbers. And then, so we are now currently at half the world's people living in cities. And so a very important point that is often overlooked in the discussion about the future of cities is that in developing countries, as people move from the village to the city, their resource consumption grows massively. Now that has to do with both access to fossil fuels and other resources, but also with the fact that obviously their consumption of resources of all kinds in terms of consumerism can go up. Greater wealth per capita cities are economic centers and so on. So this is a very important point in the discussion about cities. In Europe and America, the impacts of urban and rural lifestyles are very similar. But in developing countries, the picture is quite different, and I think that's an important discussion. But the final point is that, and relating to impacts, is cities are located on relatively small surface areas on the planet, just 3 or 4%. But they use the bulk of the world's resources and discharge the bulk of wastes. And so that needs to be addressed head-on when we look at an urban future. So just a few images to illustrate these input-output kind of realities. The extraordinary wastes that come from our cities. On the left here is the largest desalination plant on the planet in Saudi Arabia, on the coast of the Gulf Coast. So obviously all of this discussion, of course, increasingly being held in the context of climate change. We've now increased CO2 emissions concentrations in the atmosphere by up to 40%. We've just exceeded 400 parts per million a couple of weeks ago for the first time. So what does that mean for temperatures on the planet, for weather irregularities, peculiarities, and so on? So we know about these developments of melting ice in Greenland. This is a recent picture from the US, and so is this one from the Colorado River. So extreme weather events, of course, as we know, are becoming a major issue around the world. So moving on from a conceptual point of view is to argue that the concept of urban ecology, which I think probably many of you are involved in studying, needs to be expanded, in my view, not just to look at the study of living organisms and their relationship to each other within the urban environment, which is the current definition of urban ecology, but to include increasingly the collective impacts of urban populations on environments beyond city limits, i.e. the ecological footprints of cities as a major component of the ecological impact of urban systems. And that ultimately we need to find ways of creating a mutually beneficial, i.e. I would say a regenerative relationship between urban populations and ecosystems. So I know that in your department here, Stephanie, you're doing a lot of work on urban metabolism, inputs and outputs into the urban system, and I did a study on this topic in the late mid-90s in London, just quantifying. This was relatively easy, by the way, to collate these figures because we had the London Research Centre and various other bodies, London Waste Centre and so on, that had in one way or another had some figures available, but it was then not that difficult to kind of come up with at least a sort of overview input-output figures for London. And so that became the basis of a lot more work by the newly created London authority that was created by the Labour government in the late 90s. So one sort of key focus that I've had in my work is to look at the urban metabolism from an input-output point of view. In other words, currently the city typically operates as a linear system, taking resources from nature, using them in our daily lives, in our transport systems, in our collective consumerism, and then the waste output that come out the other end. And in an urbanizing world where we're currently at 50%, but going up to 70, 80% of perhaps within 50 years or 30 years of human populations living in cities, that kind of system is not compatible with the world's ecosystems. So we better learn from how nature's systems work as essentially circular systems and find much more subtle ways of adapting and living with ecosystems if we are serious about an urban future. And so there's a lot of studies now going on in different cities. In Dubai, a friend of mine did this recent study trying to understand resource flows through Dubai and trying to then get through to decision makers to improve the efficiency of that resource use. But it's still only primarily about efficiency, rather than about going beyond that and saying, okay, we need to not just be more efficient in what we do, but we also need to be serious about regenerating water courses, water bodies, generally forests and soils and so on that ultimately we rely on for the future. So from my work on London's metabolism, I extrapolated these figures on London's ecological footprint. And London as a system requires roughly the surface area of the UK, but with only 12% of the UK's population. So that's not a very sustainable way of operating a city. And that has to do, of course, with diets, with, you know, if you had a much less meat-based diet, that would dramatically reduce that figure. But of course, the question is, how can that land be found? Because if it can't be found in the UK, where else can it be found? You know, so obviously we use your wheat, Canadian, Australian soya beans from the Amazon and so on, as a basis for our urban living. But increasingly, countries around the rest of the world want to adopt our standards of living, European American standards of living. So the land availability will be less and less. So I don't know to what extent you are looking at footprints here in your work, ecological footprints.
Not in this form,
no. No. So I mean, yeah.
Supply chain impacts.
Yeah.
Using life cycle analysis.
Well, the person who invented this concept of the ecological footprint is actually in Vancouver, Professor William Rees, and he basically said a city's footprint is made up of the surface areas required to feed a city, to supply with both food from land and from sea, but also, very importantly, there needs to be land set aside, land surface, or some living surfaces that need to be set aside to be able to absorb the CO2 emissions that come from our cities. And that is actually a very large proportion of the ecological footprint, and typically we do not set aside those land surfaces. But the actual surface areas required for cities themselves are really quite small in proportion to the rest of the footprint. So this is a kind of ecological footprint. This is two pictures at the top are from the Amazon, where I did a lot of documentary work some years ago. In the bottom left-hand corner, what it used to look like, then the conversion of the forest to cattle ranches, and as well as to these massive mining operations, again, typically for metals used in urban construction elsewhere on the planet. So these are the kind of visual representations of the ecological footprint of a city far away from the Amazon. Well, this striking picture is from the southern edge of the Amazon, from Mato Grosso, which used to be an area largely of what they call cerradio, sort of savanna region, mainly grassland, grazed by emus and antelopes and so on. And this has all been plowed up for the production of soybeans. In Europe, cattle feed, pig feed, but increasingly, of course, for demand from China and elsewhere in Asia, where the lifestyles, you know, going towards much more meat-based diets, and therefore the need for soybeans from somewhere else on the planet. So extraordinary dependence on fossil fuel energy for plowing up and then harvesting these fields. They are the largest fields on the planet, can be as much as 100,000 acres a field. Absolutely astonishing sizes. And some very, very wealthy people there now. And the story of oil, of course, you know, as we gradually get towards peak oil, the production by which oil is produced is increasingly dirty. This is oil shales from Athabasca, tar sands, in Canada, and those are the sort of main sources of energy supply now to the United States. Canada is the largest importer of oil to this country at this moment in time, and very, very low net energy output from the production of the oil, because it all needs to be boiled. Basically, you start with the tar sand that needs to be boiled in order then to release the oil, and that then causes horrendous wastewater, which then ends up in huge lagoons, which the birds don't recognize as being polluted. So, yeah, so the shrinking planet. By the way, it's getting more upbeat in a moment, but for the moment, just a few stark facts of the reduction of land availability as a result of human numbers going up and up. We are now at about 2 hectares per person, global hectares per person available for both all of humanity, plus all the other millions of species that coexist with us, and that as a direct result of...
Fortunately, some of them are minuscule.
They're minuscule, that's true.
They're in the earth, you know.
That's true.
I just...
So just a quick look at water, and I know some of you have done a lot more work on water than I would ever do, and particularly on the Colorado River. But I was just recently, my family and I, we went to visit the Grand Canyon, and we saw some of the realities there, and saw the extraordinary reliance of many cities, including Los Angeles, on not only direct water supply, but also on the irrigation water from this river. But you know this picture, don't you? So 50% full now, the Lake Mead, only 50% full, and so this extraordinary 450, I think, miles long pipelines that are required for Los Angeles. So I don't want to go into much more detail because you've done much more work on this. One interesting point which I found was that certainly, despite growing numbers, the actual overall water consumption has not gone up very much.
It's decreasing.
Even decreasing. So these are partly the result of policy measures and new available technologies. But certainly when it comes to water systems, I think there's a lot of work now going on the general concept of best practice. And when it comes to cities, learning from each other, certainly Singapore is a great teacher on how to make better use of water. Not just relying on fresh water, then flushing it through our daily lives, but instead to really get serious about recycling. So, I mean, all of this, of course, we know about, you know, and this is the standard way of using water, but they have added to the system that you would be using here by getting some desalinated water, but most importantly, they're really serious about wastewater recycling, both for flushing, for dual use, for flushing toilets and so on, as well as direct resupply of wastewater into the drinking water stream. So certainly when it comes to clever ways of manipulating and making much more efficient use of water, that is a city one can really learn from a great deal. And I'm going to be there in a couple of weeks to kind of understand better what they've actually been doing and how they've achieved these results in policy and technology terms. Now, an important point as part of this talk is, you know, where does change come from? And so certainly a lot of people are saying, and these friends of mine in London from an organization called Sustainability say that cities come to house more and more people, metabolize a greater share of resources, and further shape the broader physical, economic, and social landscape we inhabit. Their sustainability becomes key to planetary sustainability. So they use the word sustainability. I might not use that in my talk, but here it is. But then important that cities are centers of innovation, and they can affect the speed and efficiency at which we develop new solutions. Furthermore, because of their growing power and influence, cities may provide a crucial means of replicating and driving successful solutions to scale. So these are the global learning processes that are now underway under the auspices of UN-Habitat, of International Council for Local Environment Initiatives, and so on. They're basically saying cities are full of intelligent people. Now we need to use that intelligence not just to make money or not just to have fun or whatever, but instead to really get serious about finding and spreading solutions to each other. So many cities are setting the example for how to confront, challenge issues head on. And as such, they provide numerous lessons for us to address sustainability challenges more widely. Now, I'm just going to go into a case study of where this kind of process has really been undertaken in a very serious way. And I was invited 10 years ago to be a thinker in residence in Adelaide, South Australia. Basically, my job was on behalf of the government of South Australia and the city government of Adelaide to rethink a city. At that time, the term was sustainability, so from a sustainability perspective. And so it was a 10-week process. Now, Adelaide, like the whole of California, is similarly dependent on the motor car for commuting, and reliance on fossil fuels as a key part of that. But first thing they did is to say, okay, how can we, and certainly what you've been doing here too, where can we get public transport to take the place of the private motor car in ways that will be acceptable to people? So they had an existing tram line which they massively extended in the last 10 years. But really importantly, they decided it was time to begin to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels in the energy system. And that's particularly important in a city region where you get very, very high summer temperatures of up to 45 degrees centigrade, which is 110, 115, I think, Fahrenheit, something like that. Anyway, very high figures for January, February, their summer months. So they have developed, they've really gone into wind power. They've gone very dramatically towards solar power, and I'll come in with more detailed figures later on. But very interestingly, they got the first buses in the world running on solar energy, which is of course not from the roof of the bus, but from the bus garage. So so basically these photovoltaic arrays there power the bus. This particular bus, and there's a few more now that are powered entirely by solar electricity. So certainly this would be very relevant, I would have thought, for Los Angeles as well. They've really gone in for retrofitting buildings from an energy efficiency point of view. The government has said we will not use any buildings that are not of the highest possible sort of LEED type of standard. And so that has happened. The private developers and property owners have really retrofitted the office buildings in a major way. And then they looked at the kind of resource use and the waste cycle. And so differentiating between the biological cycles, the organic waste from the city, and the technical cycle as a very important difference. So here, the technical cycle, they've really gone serious about moving towards zero waste and turning plastics into something useful again.
Do they do that there?
Some of it there, and some of it also still exported to China, but with increasing tendencies towards doing it locally. Creating nice furniture and fence posts and so on from old plastic bottles. Of course, you can do it with clothes as well, and quite a few other ways in which to reuse plastics. But I mean, when you have mixed plastics, it's better to come up with planks and thicker materials that can accommodate this kind of sandwich of different types of plastics. And then the organic waste. That's something that I'm really proud of, because they've really gone in for massive composting. There's a company called Jeffries, which I worked with quite closely at the time, and they went from something like 20,000 tons of compost 10 years ago to 180,000 tons. And much of it ends up on local farmland, which is very poor in terms of nutrient and carbon levels. So a lot of the compost, the organic waste from the city, get returned to this area called Virginia, which is also irrigated by wastewater. This is the wastewater pipe that they built. And here are the market gardens that are being irrigated by recycled wastewater. So this is, I think, a serious attempt at being a regenerative rather than just a sustainable city, because you give the nutrients from wastewater plus the organic material from the solid organic waste back to the farmland as an input into long-term fertility and increased carbon potential composition of the soil. So you end up with very nice crops which are then sold in this rather wonderful place called the Central Market, all of which basically, it's almost like an agropolis as a local supply source which could continue indefinitely from refertilized soils. Another thing they've done started a very major reforestation initiative on the edge of the city to counter soil erosion, but also to increase the surface area of the land, because if you plant a tree on a bit of land, you can increase its surface area by 20 times, you know. That then increases its carbon absorption capacity. So they've reforested very large scale, 4 million trees by now, in the vicinity of Adelaide.
I would assume that there are water issues in terms of the trees, reforestation.
Well, obviously the gum trees do absorb some water, but you know, they can exist with relatively low water levels, and initially there needs to be irrigation. But I mean, there's large areas of forest in Australia that manage with very, very low water input. So yeah, I mean, certainly with European or exotic trees that ultimately don't fit into the environment, you end up with water absorption problems potentially by the trees, yeah. But anyway, here's a summary of what has been done in converting a city from what was a truly unsustainable place to something towards an urban regenerative system. And I've listed quite a few of the points already, so I don't want to go into that necessarily in detail. But certainly it is very exciting to have been part of a process which was a whole series of seminars every day with decision makers and bringing together people who had not really worked and discussed these things before, and gradually coming up with a very integrated process that was then. So I wrote a report with 32 recommendations, all of which were eventually adopted by the government. So certainly the key part of it is the factor 4, factor 5 reduction in resource use by intelligent new policy as well as technology measures. And factor 5 was a recent book by the German academic Ernst von Weizsäcker, who was actually at Santa Barbara University for a couple of years. So basically, as we have an ever more urbanizing world, and cities, as they grow, particularly in developing countries, demand ever more resources from the planet, the key question is how can that be achieved by much greater resource efficiency? And so certainly Amory Lovins, of course, has been working on these issues here for years as one of the pioneering voices in this field, including being very influential with Jerry Brown in the 70s here. So energy efficiency of buildings, how that can be improved, new insulation materials. This picture may puzzle you. Do you know what you think of what it might be?
Under an insulation product with a flower on top, showing it's not burning, I guess.
Yes.
Or melting or wilting or anything.
Maybe it was right before.
It's a new insulation material called aerogel, which actually American companies are really pushing now, which is about, it's a tenth as thick as conventional fiberglass or rock wool materials. So there's more and more. There's another material called vacuum insulation panels. Again, similarly thin, but have the enormous insulation effect. And for us in Europe, with a lot of historical facades, it's particularly interesting to be able to put these things on the inside of buildings without losing too much space within the building, within the rooms. So this is important as a new technology, in addition to many other technologies available for much more efficient ways of operating buildings. And so certainly this is beginning to catch on in Europe. Here's an interesting example of a building that has been retrofitted recently, the Empire State Building. It was as part of this C40 initiative by Clinton and others. They retrofitted the Empire State Building, and it's now 3 times as efficient as it was before, not 5 times, but certainly it's been a remarkable example of how you can take an existing building and make it much more efficient. So in my view, we need to move out of petropolis in some sort of way and move into ecopolis. And this is, of course, draws to some extent, or quite an extent, on the original idea of agropolis, but argues that obviously we're not going to get all our food and everything suddenly from around the corner, and that is not going to happen. But we certainly can be more locally self-reliant than we currently are. And when you go to, LA farmers market, you see what sort of a really vigorous movement that has become. Thousands of farmers markets around the US now. Really dramatic increase in urban agriculture in various places. So this is an interesting part of a sort of evolving story. But the important thing is not only to think of local more local food supplies, but also to think of more local energy supplies. And I've worked on a project in China called Dongtan Eco City, which is finally, after some delays, starting construction. This is on the bridge on the other side of Pudong. And there was a lot of publicity about it a few years ago, and then it was all a bit embarrassing because it didn't happen. But now finally there is a city called Shenji Dongtan Eco City starting construction, where these ideas of resource efficiency, regenerative development and so on are beginning to be realized. And one of the ideas we had right from the start was to build a new city on farmland, but only taking up a relatively small proportion of the farmland, instead to have fairly compact, housing estates, 5- or 6-story apartment blocks surrounded by a lot of greenery. But then also those apartment blocks in the city as a whole surrounded by farmland would then benefit from the urban organic waste that could be brought back and kept to be used to keep the farmland productive. Or you may have read about Mazda in Abu Dhabi. Now that has only about this much of it has been realized so far. Unfortunately, I was there recently, and certainly the first part of it is quite interesting because it learns directly from the relatively narrow lanes in traditional Arabian cities like Shibam in Yemen, with these tall high-rise buildings that they constructed hundreds of years ago, 5-, 6-, 8-story buildings. So how to shade the footpaths, the lanes within the city, and how to assure that buildings are well insulated and with solar panels on the roof and so on. How one can construct a modern city, learning from traditional best practice as much as possible. But we can come back to that. But in terms of moving out of petropolis and moving towards an urban system relying much more on renewable energy, certainly that has to be policy driven to a large extent. And certainly one of the pioneers in policy on renewable energy was actually Jerry Brown again in the 70s here in California. Came up with the concept of feed-in tariffs. I'm not quite sure what they were called then here in California. But they were it's basically a policy that enables a consumer of electricity, a producer of solar electricity, to charge a higher price per kilowatt hour than a conventional power station in order to then make it a cost-effective investment. So in Germany, in 50 countries worldwide now, this has been adopted, including in parts of the United States, in Gainesville, Florida, for instance.
IDWP.
Yeah, so quite a few, in Oregon also, they have adopted feed-in tariffs. And it's basically, it had an amazing trigger effect in the country where I originally come from, in Germany, by accelerating the introduction of not only renewable energy, but also creating a new economy out of it. The job creation from it was remarkable. Certainly, the solar potential is much, much smaller, much less than very tall cities with, limited surface areas on which to collect the energy of the sun. So certainly the advantage of going for solar in city regions such as, Southern California is really very, very remarkable. And examples from elsewhere show what can be done with buildings, such as here in Taiwan, a solar stadium, which was recently constructed which is an amazing building, which obviously supplies electricity to the sportsmen and women who are in the stadium. But when they're not there, it's a power station, and that certainly is, you can find.
Does it generate enough power to support these?
Yeah, it generates enough power for sports events, but including with some battery storage. But it certainly is, every day when the sun shines, it's a double use, a twin use building on the one hand, a sports center on the other, and a power station. And you see these kind of landscapes now appearing across Europe. Now this looks like rather like a, sealed and not much nature and evidence, except the sheep could carry on grazing between the solar panels. So this could still see that. Or these concentrated solar power stations that you now find in Spain, which are, Seville is largely self-sufficient now in solar electricity, including the latest power station which they've built, which can store electricity, can store the heat from this system. It's a heat-based system, even after dark, in molten salt solutions. So you have electricity till 1 or 2 in the morning, or even later. So this is certainly now, you could find, we drove past this particular solar power station just the other day, coming from Las Vegas on the way south to Los Angeles. And so the first part of this has been now completed. I don't know the name of it. And here then the cars to go with the solar electricity. So Mr. Musk is certainly working hard to get his act together on the new car technologies, and you can see these now quite often in the streets of Los Angeles. So this is a 100% solar, 100% electric car, and it's certainly very impressive. Or see these solar-powered electric bikes that you could find now. Moving on to wind technology, feed-in tariffs in Germany and elsewhere have had a massive contribution to make to the development of this technology, from these small turbines 30 years ago to 5, 6, 7 megawatt turbines, which are now the norm, and which are being used both onshore and offshore. So certainly, I think we can be quite confident in moving towards a future where renewable energy will play a key central role in the energy supply to our cities, wherever possible from nearby, but sometimes from further afield. And in the case of Britain, for instance, there's a lot of offshore wind parks now being developed. London is just recently, in the Thames estuary, they've just completed a wind farm called the Thames Array, which supplies electricity for some 300,000 households from one wind farm in the Thames estuary. And several others are being built on the British coast. Moving on to another subject, urban agriculture. In China, it's very interesting. There used to be farms right inside cities. Quite, the norm to find a little pocket of agriculture going on right inside the city. That has changed as a result of urban growth, but Shanghai as a city still administers an area of farmland the size of the city itself, some 300,000 hectares of land on the outskirts of the city being administered by the city authorities to supply, stir-fry vegetables. They like their vegetables fresh. They don't like wilted vegetables to put in their cooking pot. So they come from close by, and that is certainly being maintained. So though grain comes from further afield. I don't know whether you've had a look at the amazing urban agriculture in Havana, Cuba. And the story there is fascinating. Basically, the collapse of the Soviet Union led to a sudden end to the supply of agricultural inputs, tractors, fuels, pesticides, sprays of all kinds from Russia, from Soviet Union. So they said, we have to change the way we feed ourselves. And they went into converting much of the interior of Havana itself, where there's a lot of open land, into little farms called organoponicos. And they are now world leaders in organic agriculture in Cuba. It's quite amazing to see that firsthand. Really, it's very, very impressive.
They've also lost a lot of arable land because of invasive plants that they weren't able to keep at bay. I can't remember the name of the specific plant.
You mean within the city?
No, within Cuba.
Oh, really?
Yeah, huge percent of their land has been taken over by a I can't remember the name of the plant.
Really?
It's a European ornamental that has just taken over. In many ways, they lost control of it in the larger farms because they no longer had power tools.
Really?
Yeah, and I can't remember, but they have moved, and also they've decentralized milk production, as part of the decentralized, the urbanization of agriculture.
Yeah. No, it's really very impressive what's been going on there. And obviously, they still export a lot of tobacco and sugar.
They do not promote. I mean, they essentially 100% organic food, but it's not promoted as part of their tourism. No one. It's sort of. They also hate bicycles. But that's bicycles are associated with the special period. When they got millions of bicycles from China, and so nobody rides bicycles if they can help it.
Well, they're like the old American automobiles. I think they're probably like newer ones even better, but they can't get them so easily. Well, But I mean, you know, this is not just something that is relevant to Cuba, but in Detroit, for instance, I mean, it's really remarkable what is happening with a lot of wasteland in Detroit, and there's major companies that are now buying up land within the city. And here's one drawing by a New York artist on how land in the city could be converted towards inner city land, not peri-urban, but intra-urban land could be converted to agriculture. And you are seeing new kind of methods of cultivation in multi-story trays and so on that are very highly relevant to cities. Or in New York, the roofs of New York you know, are becoming increasingly places for growing crops and so on. Or here, the wonderful farmers markets, as I already said. But certainly the whole question of remaining in the balance with the biosphere is, I think, of absolutely critical importance. And I think from a point of view of academic research, it is critically important to develop a much clearer understanding of how systems, urban systems function within themselves as well as in their relationship to the biosphere. And maybe we can discuss that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So coming to the end of my talk is, I'm certainly arguing that sustainability as a concept is no longer sufficient. We have, it's no longer good enough to sustain already depleted ecosystems and environments. And sustainability, in my view, is a relatively passive term, whereas I think trying to think about regenerative cities, regenerative development is kind of quite specifically concerned about how we can re-enrich those places that cities take for granted as places that they get their resources from. So obviously this needs to be seen in a global, national and local context. We need to weigh the cost of action against the cost of inaction. There's been a lot of work in that context on climate change, particularly by Nicholas Stern in London. There need to be new partnerships between academia, community groups, NGOs, politics and the business community in trying to understand urban systems and then try and act differently. And then certainly we need legislation. We can't just let the market take care of it. It's no longer good enough, I don't think, simply to allow the market to operate by itself. So we need carrots wherever possible, but certainly sometimes sticks that drive change. And so certainly the whole question of how environmental regeneration is of local benefit, including to the local economy, is of really critical importance. So, specifically what I argue is that we need a new sort of attitude to give and take by cities in their relationship to the rest of the world. So that obviously means energy systems, soil regeneration, also plant nutrients put back in soils from urban wastewater and waste management. Regeneration of forests happens not often enough. But here's an example of how that, where a city has, on the one hand, started taking initiatives to regenerate its own environment, inter-urban environment here in South Korea. But they've also, at the receiving end of the impacts of depleted environments elsewhere, are in the Gobi Desert, which is in China and Mongolia rather than in South Korea. So they have started, together with the Chinese authorities, developing reforestation projects in the Gobi Desert from Seoul, which is quite fascinating. So reforestation by people in Seoul of areas of the Gobi Desert has started together with Chinese initiatives. And here's just one visual example of a regeneration of a damaged landscape in the Yellow River in China, which looked like this about 20 years ago, and it looks like this now. And this is partly because the cities and along the Yellow River were suffering really seriously from soil being washed down and water pollution from soil and so on. So together with local cities and the Chinese government and the World Bank, a massive reforestation initiative was started, turning what was depleted land. And there's a beautiful film about this made by a friend of mine called John Liu, showing the transformation of a landscape as a result of deliberate initiatives. So to finish my talk then, basically, urban ecology needs to take into account global ecology in new ways, because an urbanizing world means global impacts as never before. And so that includes terrestrial issues, water issues, carbon and climate issues in ways that really need to lead to a new mindset. And this last picture, do you know what this is? Any idea? Any take? $10.
Your brain.
The what? $20. It's a portrait of the internet with cities as the white dots. Global connectedness. I think the global learning process that are needed in an urbanizing world are, really, it's absolutely enormously important to get these learning processes right. And this is one of the things I think you are engaged in here in your department, and I'm also involved in with my work. Thank you very much.